Okay, now that we've spent a little bit of time with the Korean War and starting to understand a little bit about the Cold War and um, what we were getting into with dealing with the Soviets, I want to take a second and kind of step back here and look at anti-communism. How did it happen? Why did we get so scared to the point where we do some actual pretty crazy things as a country? So we're going to look at anti-communism between 1945 and 1954, and we're going to try and decide, is it a witch hunt, or was it actually a menace that needed um, to be dealt with? And so if you read The Crucible, the idea that we were just chasing around random people, saying that they were communists, convicting them, putting them in jail, is the witch hunt side of it. The other side of it is that it was a menace. It was something that was a real threat that we had to deal with, and that we were at war. And if we didn't deal with them, that they could do something to possibly hurt the country or maybe even bring down the country. Some people viewed the communist threat as more of a problem, more of an issue from internal than it was external. And we'll talk about that. So we're going to start out with is these guiding questions. And what you're going to be looking at is basically three things you need to be able to do. We're going to do basically three different lessons. We're going to talk about why the Soviet Union had spies here, what they look like in our first lesson. Second lesson, we're going to look at the House Committee on Un-American Activity. And third lesson, we're going to look specifically at Joseph McCarthy. So you're going to have to be able to answer these questions in some way, shape, or form. So it's a good idea that you pause here, write them down on your notes. So as you go through this, make sure you take good notes. And these are something I would put on my notes because you're going to need them for later. So why was Soviet espionage important? Okay, why did we care? What was going on? Okay, from my perspective, your perspective, it's like, okay, yeah, whatever, they might have had spies, but how big of a deal was it? That's the first thing we're going to look at. The second thing we're going to do is try and define what it means to be un-American. And how did the House Committee on Un-American Activities, that's the abbreviation there, how did they define it? What did that mean? Third thing is we're going to look at the most famous guy from this time period, Joseph McCarthy, and what did he have to do with this? How basically the rise and fall, how he comes from nowhere to be super important, and how he basically goes back to being unimportant really quickly. So we'll spend some time looking at him. All right, so background. By the mid-1940s, we started to figure out that we had a spy problem. Okay, the communists and spies had infiltrated America. And here's some of the kind of three main points. First of all, many of the spies were homegrown. Okay, so this was not an issue. We had to look for people coming in from other countries. A lot of them were right from America, which was scary because, like, why was this happening? What was going on? Second of all, many of the spies served in the federal government, some in leadership roles. And that was really scary because people are like, if the government's been infiltrated, what next? What's happening? Are people plotting to bring down the government? And we'll talk about a few of those famous people, but for the most part, you just need to know that there were quite a few people that were quote-unquote communist sympathizers, people that thought that communism was okay or ideologically believed in communism over capitalism in the government, and people realized that and it scared them. The third background thing that really makes this important is we have to understand the Manhattan Project to develop the nuclear bombs during the war. And I mentioned this when we did World War II. Stalin already knew that were developing a nuclear bomb because he had spies there. We didn't know it at the time. But by the mid-1940s, the end of the 1940s, right after the war, we figure out that they knew and that they had spies. So some of the captured spies or some people had flipped. And they started talking, saying we had spies. And by 1949, the Soviets are testing their own bomb, and we're like, uh-oh, this isn't good. And people started to view the fact that they were testing their own bomb as a result of their spy network, not of their scientists, and that really scared people. If they stole this, what else are they going to do? So, public reaction to the realization that Soviets had spies. First of all, and probably it makes most sense to believe this, people were worried. We had the war on the outside going in. Things like Korea, we need nuclear weapons. We had the Berlin airlift. So you had a real threat of war and possibly even nuclear war from the outside. But on top of that, you had a huge threat coming from in the country. People believed that the internal threat in some cases was worse than the external threat because they were threatening to bring down the government. They were selling secrets. They were plotting. They were doing things that this is what people thought. So first was in fear of the inside, not just the outside. So that starts a period of intense fear and questioning. Okay, who's a communist? Who's not a communist? How do we know if you're communist? How do we know if you're not communist? If you say anything critical about the government, then you could be a communist. So during this period of intense fear and questioning, we're basically going to lose a lot of civil rights. Okay, people aren't going to have the freedom of speech that they normally would, because if you say anything, all of a sudden now you're going to be questioned as being a communist. That would be un-American, and we'll talk more about that. And the third thing is that we realized people that were spying weren't motivated by money, but by ideology, which doesn't make sense to a lot of Americans. People weren't doing this because they wanted money. They weren't, in some cases, being paid at all. They were doing this because they believed in communism as a better way of life or a better form of government than what we were. They believed that everyone, in some ways, should be treated equally. And for whatever reason, they were disillusioned with what was going on here. So those things really scare people, because it's like, okay, we can't just find the money that they have. We can't pay them off. We can't do something. It's not about money for a lot of these people. It's about what they believe or their ideology. All right, terms and people to know. For here, you're going to need to take down notes for each of these people or each of the videos. So you have a couple different things that you're going to do here. Make sure that you can identify the people or the terms here. Make sure you understand what's going on. You may need to pause and watch the videos for a second. What I'll do is I'll put the links on the actual video so you can click on them instead of just in the Prezi. But we'll watch the videos together, and then I'll let you just pause and read through the text. You basically need to be able to do who, what, where, when, why. You can do that in paragraph form, list form. I don't care, but you need to be able to, if I say what is this, you need to be able to say what that is. So here's the first video clip.
In 1949, the Soviet Union explodes its first atom bomb. But was the design stolen from American nuclear secrets? The answer would emerge only after the Cold War ended, when archives like this one in Moscow began to open to scholars.
I was nervous because here was this massive untapped resource. I was the first American, as far as I knew, and certainly one of the first Westerners to be in this archive.
When historians Harvey Clare and John Haynes examined the top secret documents, they were startled.
Like code names.
Buried in the files were lists of names of U.S. government employees from World War II.
I recognized many of the names that were handwritten. Charles Kramer, Victor Perlow, Judy Copland.
All had been accused of being Soviet spies. The charges never stuck. But were they true?
Okay, so the purpose of that video is basically we're going to look at a time period where people didn't know what was going on. There were people who were being accused. We didn't understand what was going on. When we kind of finish this up and wrap it up, we'll look back at some of the things that have been declassified. But there was a lot of people that were accused that never were convicted, and then there was a lot more people that were accused that were convicted. So we're going to have the House, I'm going to have you guys do the notes on the other three after you watch the last video, and then you guys will have the House Un-American Activity Committee, Joseph McCarthy, the NOAA Project, and Alger Hiss. So I guess it's actually 4. So let's watch this last one. I'll talk about it, and then you'll do notes on those 4.
One of the greatest peacetime spy dramas in the nation's history reaches its climax as Julius Rosenberg and Morton Sobel, convicted of revealing atomic secrets to the Russians, enter the federal building in New York to hear their doom. Another of the spy ring Mrs. Ethel Rosenberg, who with her husband was convicted of actually transmitting the secrets to Russia through Soviet diplomatic channels. The ring was first uncovered following the arrest of Klaus Fuchs in England. David Greenglass, Mrs. Rosenberg's brother, confessed theft of the secrets while stationed at the Los Alamos atomic project. He later became the government's chief witness in the prosecution of Sobel and the Rosenbergs. It is a stern jurist they face in Judge Irving Kaufman. After administering a tongue lashing in which he charged them with the indirect death of thousands of men in Korea, he sentenced both Rosenbergs to death in the electric chair and Sobel to 30 years in prison. At the time these pictures were made, Greenglass still had to hear his fate. It is the first time in peacetime that such a death penalty has been handed down, and while appeals to the highest courts are planned, it certainly appears that the spies are headed along a one-way street.
Okay, so I will let you guys finish up with the last three things here in a second. But what's sort of interesting about the Rosenbergs is that they're a middle class family, nothing abnormal, nothing typical. He had a background of being before the war, of being a communist sympathizer, active in the Communist Party for America and stuff. But once the war started, he stopped, got out of it, and they are actually killed for what they did. They didn't shoot anyone, they didn't do anything, but they were convicted of passing atomic secrets to the Soviets. And in some cases, some very detailed secrets, drawings, copies. And we now know a lot more details than what they knew back then, based on some of the other things. The FBI, when you do the Vanilla Project, they had information on some of these people and bits and pieces from code they'd cracked, but they hadn't actually told anyone about it. It was still top secret. So you'll need to know the Rosenbergs, because we're going to do a little bit. We're going to spend some time talking about them. So at this point, I'll put the links up for the other four things I want you to do. Basically, make sure you can tell me who they are and why they were important. And then you will be finished.